Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, a spending watchdog has warned that paying for schools and hospitals through the private finance initiative will cost hundreds of billions of pounds. The National Audit Office said taxpayers will have to foot a £199 billion bill for projects outsourced to private companies over the next 3 decades under the PFI. The report was compiled even before one of the government's main PFI contractors, Carillion, went into liquidation earlier this week. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, reports.
The plastic roof of this school academy flapping in the breeze. It's on a checklist of dozens of jobs that the government's private sector provider, Carillion, was supposed to fix. It had a complex contract to maintain the building for 25 years. But rather than feeling left high and dry by Carillion's collapse, the head here is relieved.
I have a list of 196 things at this school which need to be done, ranging from the large, air conditioning, the roof, down to block toilets, dripping taps, light bulbs that need to be changed. And that's the level of angst, hassle, non-delivery that we've got from this contract.
Part of the problem, he says, is that Carillion ran this private finance initiative project, or PFI, through a complex web of special purpose vehicles and other companies. There was too much bureaucracy that only served to push up the costs.
I do know that in education, a lot of these PFI contracts are very poor contracts. They are hugely expensive. We think often 20 to 25% more costly than providing a service in-house, and they really aren't delivering for schools. So in my view, we need to have a very serious look at whether we can get out of some of these contracts.
It's not just schools. Today's damning National Audit Office report raises questions about the value of all PFI projects. There are now 716 of them across the country. The government will have to pay £199 billion more for the services over the next 30 years. But the report says these projects have higher costs than if the government simply provided the services through the public sector. For example, some PFI schools cost 40% more. The government has always claimed that PFI deals offer the taxpayer value for money, but even here the report was equally damning. It said ministers' claims had never been backed up by evidence and as such were unproven. And it revealed another nugget. George Osborne, as Chancellor, considered bringing all the PFI projects onto the government's books, but the change was rejected for fear the extra debt could undermine Britain's credit rating. Instead, PFI was rebranded as PF2, with a promise of greater transparency and accountability on costs. So far, there have been 6 projects under this new model, and one of them is this flagship metropolitan hospital in the West Midlands, run by, you guessed it, Carillion. We know the government's initial price for the Metropolitan Hospital was £350 million, but that was later revised upwards to £430 million when the contract was agreed. But what we now know is that spiralling costs on that and 2 other projects were, in the end, partly responsible for tipping Carillion over the edge. So the government's promise of transparency and accountability, in this case at least, weren't delivered.
The taxpayer has not been getting value for money from PFI. Now, it was perhaps reasonable to look at PFI at one point if it was going to save the taxpayer money. But if we know that it's not, then there is no justification for using it.
All well and good, but let's not forget PFI projects ballooned in use under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. But they were continued under the Tories too, and even in the case of Carillion, expanded to include a new high-speed 2 rail contract, just weeks after the company had issued a massive profit warning last summer. The Transport Secretary Chris Grayling said today the HS2 contract was given to a group of companies, not just Carillion, and insisted the project would be delivered on time.
Siobhan Kennedy reporting. Well, Michael Crick is outside the Department for Business, where a task force is meeting to discuss the collapse of Carillion. Michael, tell us more.
Well, the task force began meeting here about 45 minutes ago. It brings together representatives of all the interested parties, bankers, trade groups, business groups, the unions, under Greg Clark, the business secretary, who's been meeting those groups on a one-to-one basis for most of this week. Among the groups that were calling for a task force, it's something that's happened in the past when there's been a crisis like this. One of the people calling for such a task force were the Federation of Small Businesses, who are particularly concerned about whether suppliers are going to be paid, and also people further down the supply chain. And they were planning to ask the business secretary whether something can be done to prioritise those suppliers who are in danger, most in danger of going bust. Another group that wanted this task force, the trade unions. And as the General Secretary of the TUC, Frances O'Grady, turned up here tonight, she told me she wants strong action from ministers.
There's plenty that the government should and could be doing to protect workers, transfer contracts in-house in public services, to Network Rail in the rail industry, and make sure that we've got companies lined up in the private sector who will make sure that workers keep getting paid. It's not an opportunity to cut their pay and pensions. We want continuity of service and we want them protected.
Well, we're not expecting any great news to emerge from this task force tonight. It's going to meet regularly over the next few days. Meanwhile, Greg Clark has welcomed money that some of the big banks have made available. Lloyds, HSBC and RBS has made available to small firms to help them out while things get resolved.
Michael, thanks very much.
Will the demise of Carillion be the crash that brings about a fundamental change of culture? The failure of Carillion has raised ideological and practical questions over what is the best and most economical way to deliver excellence in everything, from schools to HS2 to hospital services. Does what's happened to Carillion demonstrate that the system is broken? In order to deal with the immediate problem, the Business Secretary today chaired the first meeting of a government task force involving business, unions and lenders to support firms and workers affected by the firm's collapse. How big a deal has outsourcing become? Here's our policy editor, Chris Cook.
This is University College London Hospital, UCLH, an NHS hospital, where devoted public employees tend the sick. But the building you can see was built by private builders, and it's managed by private contractors. It's a parable about how the British state has been changed by our contracting out culture.
The key thing to understand about outsourcing is the contract. Outsourcing a service means that someone somewhere has to write down on a sheet of paper what exactly the government wants, what they're willing to pay for it, and the consequences if they don't get it. And if the contractor is a private company, you can have really brutal consequences because you don't care if they go bust. Now, that's not credibly true if you're dealing with, for example, an NHS hospital. The thing is, though, this contractual thinking affects the government's relationships with all sorts of institutions, including those in the public sector.
The last major review of nurses' pay was 5 years ago.
Back in the 1980s, the government found that hospitals couldn't tell it how much they spent on one procedure or another. Some didn't know how many staff they actually employed. These days, they're all set clear targets and they're paid for the work that they do. They're treated more like a contractor than hospitals of old. Jeremy Corbyn's own borough of Islington has found success raising standards in some areas through contracting out. But it's also bringing some services back in-house.
15 years ago, housing management in Islington wasn't in a great place, and the council took the decision, with the support of residents, to put that out to an arm's length organisation. They were much better housing managers, and housing management got better, but 3 or 4 years ago, we took a very pragmatic decision to bring it back in-house, which was the right decision. It saved us a lot of money and it's allowed us to deliver a better service because we're not having duplication of legal departments, communications and all sorts of other things as well.
There are some serious difficulties with outsourcing. First, contract pricing for years ahead is hard and you can end up overpaying or underpaying, and those errors won't even out. Outsourcing companies will try to bank overpayments and walk away from underpayments. Secondly, outsourcing could lead to fractured services.
it's really hard to get public contracts that reflect the complexity of what people have to do. And I think the public are driven mad by phoning up a public service provider just to be told that they can't do a particular thing because it's not in their contract and they have to phone someone else. What the public really want is services that understand that they're real human beings with a whole range of kind of complex needs and issues going on and are able to deal with all of those.
Third, contracts sometimes presume contractors have to borrow money to invest. That happened with the PFI at UCLH. But given the state can borrow more cheaply than anyone else, that is a waste of money. Fourth, we often see contracts given to companies who have no relevant track record, as though expertise is unimportant. And finally, outsourcing also often means workplaces where staff work for many different employers. So some employees will find it difficult to progress to other roles where they work, adding to the precariousness of a lot of already hard working lives.
Chris Cook. Well, Phil Bentley is the chief executive of the outsourcing company Mighty, which holds many government contracts. This is his first interview since the collapse of Carillion. Thanks very much for coming in.
Pleasure. Good evening.
Do you want Carillion's public contracts?
We don't have as many public contracts as Carillion had with the government, but we do have some. I think the more important thing is what can we do to help those people who are worried about their jobs today, the hard-working people who work at Carillion. And I think the government's doing the right thing to sort of put a stop on it and say, look, let's just fund it and continue to look at where we get value from the outsourcers and ensure that those employees working for Carillion are not concerned about are they going to get paid next week, for example. So, you know, our thoughts are really with them at the start, but we are an outsourcer. We do cleaning, we do catering, we do engineering services, and we do the sort of essential services that a lot of clients, you know, rely on us for, and I think we'll continue to do.
But interesting, for example, on the Carillion contracts, if you were going for them, will you go in at a higher price and therefore you suffer perhaps the wrath of the taxpayer, or at a lower price and actually put yourself at higher risk?
Well, I think the government would say they're pretty good at getting a good deal, and you look at the difficulties that Carillion have got into, and I'm in Mighty, I'm not in Carillion obviously, so I'm not close to it, but from what I can tell, Carillion's difficulties got in two areas. One, they had big overruns, cost overruns on fixed price contracts, which actually, you know, that's a risk transfer.
Yes.
The second thing, they had quite a lot of debt and a lot of pension deficits as well, and that's not the sort of business that we're in.
The problem is, though, is that often for outsourcing, companies, including yours, Serco, Interserve and everything, go in at a very low price because, of course, the government procurement looks at it and goes, we need a low price here for the taxpayer. But the lowest price may not be the best deal.
I agree, absolutely agree with you. And
have you done that? Have you ever done that?
We make all the time. It's not just about price, and we often say, you know, we can't offer a cheaper mop and a bucket. We want a smarter one. We want to know how productive it is. We want to know where it's been. And that's really where I think technology can help the industry provide analysis. And the point you made in the clip about not knowing how much things cost, we can give our clients real-time information about what's really going on in their premises, and they value that.
Yes, but it is still an imprecise science. Before you came, Mighty sold off healthcare business and care for the elderly for £2 that they bought for 111 million. That's a pretty hefty write-down.
I mean, that was before my time.
I did say that.
I have to say that, but the other point I would make, it's about risk, and it's about risk pricing. If you've priced the Aberdeen bypass at 500 million, that's a fixed price contract, and if it's going to cost you £1 billion, you're on the hook for that. And so you would argue, actually, that...
So do you like to take more of the risk?
No, I think we should be making sure that the risk we take is appropriate for the contract we're signing up with and is appropriate for our financial situation. Because we are 2.2 billion of revenue and 2.1 billion and a bit of costs. The actual sliver that is profit, which has got to be reinvested, is at risk if we don't price contracts properly.
But maybe you don't take enough profit to give yourself that contingency that you're not going to get from a government contract because you're so desperate, as the others are, to get these contracts. Well, and that's the problem for outsourcing.
I don't think it is, actually. In fact, we look after Lloyds Bank, Vodafone, we clean the Houses of Parliament, we clean Buckingham Palace. These are contracts that are profitable contracts, and they should continue to be, because we're expert at what we do, we focus, we've got scale, and hopefully we get it right and we understand risk. We don't always get it right, but hopefully we get it right more often than not.
But you have just got, I mean, G4S lost the contract for escorting prisoners, a Home Office contract. Now, you went in, Serco went in, you got it. I mean, it was a £500 million contract that the G4S lost. So therefore, do you think that on that contract, the danger is that you are going to take too much risk as well? And then, you know, because obviously G4S had a problem, who's to say you won't have a problem?
Well, it was Capita, to be fair,
yes,
to
Capita
G4S.
from within G4S.
And look, this has been a contract that's been 9 months in the gestation. This is not something that, you know, we award a contract overnight. There's been a lot of conversations about risk, a lot of conversations about pricing. Actually, we have caps and floors in the pricing, so that if there is a change, and who knows how many immigrants we have and what we're dealing with here. So we've got to price risk into the contract.
So what was your profit margin on the former Capita contract?
We'd say quite low, but we'd say
what
appropriate for the risk. Well, that's obviously commercially we're not going to disclose.
But the danger is it's too low, and then there's a danger is it's too low, and you have yourself at a risk that's unacceptable.
I can tell you now, we have looked over this contract as a board in a lot of detail. We actually provide services at Heathrow, and there is a synergy between escorting and Heathrow Airport where we operate today. So you've got to look at the business you're in.
Jeremy Corbyn says, very briefly, £10 living wage, call a halt to the outsourcing racket.
We are supportive of the living wage and always have been.
Thank
and
you
we will be at Mighty.
Thank you very much indeed.